to talk, and I think that it's an exciting presentation. So I can start.
Ok, ok. Bom,
Thank you.
primeiro boas-vindas a todos aqui. Excepcionalmente, essa reunião é do GT de Rotulagem, liderado aqui pela Liliane, da 3M, e pela Juliana, de Bict, e co-liderado, de alguma maneira, eternamente pelo Felipe Coelho, que está aqui com a gente, da Fundação Rosilini.
Thanks.
Nós temos aqui a ilustre oportunidade, o convidado do Sebastiaan Stiller, da EPD International, que vai fazer a sua palestra inicial, para todos estarmos aí na mesma página, e depois abrimos para um debate. Como a gente adiantou, essa palestra vai ser em inglês. Quem não estiver confortável de alguma maneira a fazer depois perguntas ou colocações em inglês, pode contar com a gente, pode colocar em português no chat, ou abrir o microfone e falar em português, e a gente vai fazer essa tradução. Como essa é uma reunião aberta e vários talvez nunca interagiram com a rede, a gente tomou a liberdade de falar 3 slides só no começo agora sobre a rede. Então, eu acho que todos me conhecem aqui como secretaria@redeacv, então meu nome é Sônia, muito feliz por tê-los aqui. Fundamentalmente, o que fazemos na rede é debater, discutir essa orientação mais integrada aos impactos no ciclo de vida ou na cadeia de valor, enfim, ter essa noção, mesmo que o nosso processo seja um elo, por exemplo, na produção, o que acontece antes desse nosso processo que a gente tende a dominar mais e o que acontece depois. Então, é essa orientação mais holística, digamos, para orientar a tomada de decisão. Primeiro, para a gente identificar melhorias de processo, mas também para a gente não transferir o problema de um elo para o outro, sabendo ou não sabendo, né? Então, não correr esse risco. Os associados da rede são de diversos segmentos, com diversos níveis de maturidade no tema, com diversas motivações para estarem atentos a essa questão. Temos mantenedores que são empresas e institucionais que são associações, academia, governo. E por causa dessa diversidade de olhares, a gente acredita que a principal contribuição que a rede pode fazer no contexto da Agenda 2030, dos ODS, é promover pontes. Então, por isso também essa reunião hoje, excepcionalmente, é aberta para ouvir de vocês o que tanto associados como não associados, o que a rede poderia fazer além de tudo que a gente já faz, que são esses vários grupos de trabalho, ações institucionais, a comissão de estudos de metodologias e também alguns olhares setoriais. A gente deve lançar mais alguns esse ano. O que a gente pode fazer para atender mais ainda os desafios de vocês? A gente tem capacitação, comunicação, grupos de trabalho, e hoje o grupo de trabalho Rotulagem está convidando a todos para a gente discutir, conhecer essas tendências globais, né, em rotulagem e as implicações de oportunidades de negócio para a gente no Brasil. Então, Sebastiaan, it's our honor to have you here. I'll give you the floor now, and please do share your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, and good day or good morning to everybody. I'm in another time zone, so I apologize for that, but I'm talking to you from Stockholm, Sweden, 2 degrees, cold and rainy, so I wish I was in your side. But I was given the honor to talk to you today and introduce you to, I would say, the EPD, and not so much about what it exactly is, so not too much about the LCA content, and not so much about how to do this, because I think the best person to ask would be then Felipe, who's more than happy to give you advice on that field. But I will talk a bit more, and you have to tell me when I'm sharing. Can you confirm?
You are, yes, perfect.
Yes. Great. So I'm more here to talk about why we do need EPDs, and I'm going to give, in that sense, I will give you some examples of in which context EPDs are currently used in different, say, contexts and in different parts of the world, and maybe also lifting a little bit of the tip of the tail of where are we heading towards in different I would say, different parts of the world also, in the sense of what are the future requirements or the needs that will come and face different kinds of actors, including regulator, but also the manufacturer, who ultimately, of course, is the provider of this kind of information. But maybe just a couple of words to who International EPD System is. So my name, and this is a picture already 3 years old, so I apologize for that. But at least it contains correct information in the sense of contact. So feel free to reach out by email or by phone if you have questions afterwards. Or as we said, for the licensee, Felipe Coelho, who is our licensee for EPD Brazil and representing our system. But the International EPD System itself is the worldwide first EPD program that was founded in Sweden in 1997. And it was a joint activity between the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, so it's an authority, and industry. The system was evolved and developed, including the different ISO standards that we're currently compliant with. But then in 2014, there was a decision that the regulator actually wanted to say this is not core business for us anymore. So they were looking for a new owner, and the new owner became a not-for-profit organization. It's called IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute, which again is an NPO that is owned by the state and by industry, but it's an acting NPO. And as that also, I'll say, some of the work has changed, and also the orientation of the work. So now EPD International, the owner of the International EPD System, is I would say, committed to making quality EPD services as credible, accessible, and affordable as possible. And we're convinced, and therefore I'm also talking to you today, that any organization, no matter its size, location, and industry, has the right to publish EPDs in a sensible, simple, and affordable way. So what we do, we are a certified body. So we offer the registration and publication services of an environmental product declaration according to ISO standards, and in some cases also European standards where necessary. That means also, in consequence, that we don't do life cycle assessment ourselves. So my company is not doing that. And we don't do verification, but we control the entire process of having from the initiation of an LCA to the publication of the results of the LCA via the EPD. We also are quite unique in the world in the sense that we don't have licensees, but also that we are working with all product categories. So here you see a few examples of products that are EPD certified. Verified, sorry, not certified, verified. So starting from construction industry to trains, airplanes, chairs, we even have urea or energy, for example, kitchens, just name it, food. So quite broad. So in essence, we offer EPDs to any kind of industry, and we have also the so-called cookbooks for that, the product category rules. But I'm not going to dive into that one today. But in essence, what it means, we make life cycle assessment comparable, and via the third-party verification step, also credible and verified. So trusted, a source of trusted data. When I now get into the reasons for an EPD, today I want to talk to you about, I would say, predominantly the external drivers, because that's really what we see as the key drivers currently in the market. Of course, we have internal drivers where companies are committed to own objectives, or they sign up to some kind of a goal or an external initiative. And I will touch that just in a couple of minutes as well. But the real drivers currently are benchmarking, future and current legal compliance, as well as compliances with more market regulated initiatives like green building schemes, for example. So benchmarking, the first topic I want to talk about, and I'm not going to go into much detail, but I think this picture is showing it quite nicely. The market needs, so the data users, so whether this is a regulator, a data analytics platform, or a software program, anybody is craving and dying to have credible, specific data. I would say 10 years ago, at least here in Europe, it was enough to have some kind of a generic EPD, generic data set, which gave you an average performance of a product, some kind of a steel on a global data set, and it was enough. But the regulator more and more wants to go know really the details. So this picture visualizes in that sense that 10 years ago, it was enough to have some kind of a figure, whether it was verified or not, on the car. But nowadays, we want to know the details of that car. So how much does that chair cost us in kilograms CO2, but also in euros? And ideally, and of course, this is what the EPD stands for then also, if you then add up all those individual separate numbers in the sense of a modular setup, you will still come to these 192 kilograms. So don't ask me if I did the calculations, but it should add up. The right side, of course, is also showing you an interesting one, which is, for example, a company from Latvia, I think Lithuania, and they have environmental product declarations on different kinds of their products. So here, actually, their supplier, the clients, can actually also compare between products from the same company. So it's not only comparing peer with peer, but also product within the company. And of course, you can also compare performance over time if you would update your EPD and then report information then again accordingly. But in essence, what is also showing is that these kind of comparisons are not just there to compare kilograms of CO2 equivalents against CO2 equivalents, but you also want to integrate that in business decisions, in financial decisions, in CapEx, for example, where you want to fall back on, have to rely on credible data. And that is also where I'll say the EPD currently is playing mostly when we think about applications like public tenders, green public tenders, where different kinds of public but also private tenders require EPDs. Otherwise, you don't get a green bonus, or you actually can't even participate in the tendering process. The second one, I would say, the drivers, future or existing legal compliance, is what I want to visualize in this picture, in this slide. Here you see, on the one hand, an industry activity, so market regulation, and on the other hand, where we are moving towards, I would say, legal compliance. So the two pictures that you see here on the right side are taken from the central station here in Stockholm, where I would say from the food industry, there was a company, Oatly, challenging the dairy producers of our country by saying like, hey, I have a non-dairy product and I'm showing you my figures. So in this case, 0.3 kilograms of CO2 per liter of substance. And so show me your results. Is this vegan product better or worse than dairy products? So actually industry is challenging itself. So they are looking into defining their level playing field. And that's the private level of playing field that I'm talking about, where companies are looking for providing proof for the climate mitigation efforts, for example, or conformity. Another driver, a very strong one, is the public sector, where they are trying to develop their own level playing field. And here in Europe, we see the green economy, where the regulator, so the European Commission in this case, is also looking for fair market competition. And what we mean with that is that they want to avoid companies making false statements on environmental performance, so any kind of greenwashing. These two level playing fields are currently being developed, and sometimes they bite each other because they follow different interests. And that's also what the first page of the slide is showing you, that there's more and more an understanding actually that from society that we want to improve our climate change activities. So we want to become better. At the same time, depending on which level of playing field you are, you're considered part of the problem or part of the solution. And I would say somewhere in between are also these initiatives, these business initiatives like value reporting, the SASB, where they try to make corporate reporting mandatory. We have the World Resources Institute and also science-based targets, which, for example, is then making use of the greenhouse gas protocol 1, 2, and 3. And when I say 1, 2, and 3, the third scope, again, then is the product scope. Also here, there's a link between the two level playing fields, the initiatives that are playing partly in one end or both fields, and where does the EPD then kick in? Because the EPD, of course, is reporting product-related information, so not organizational performance, but product performance information. This is something where I brought you a couple of examples. For market regulation, I brought with you an example for LEED. And in LEED, you may know what LEED is. It's from the Green Building Council, and it's used for buildings to actually give a reward or award sustainable buildings, I would say. And in their scheme, currently there's two options to achieve credits with the use of EPDs. And I would say I will quickly touch upon the two options. The first option is providing environmental product declarations, which will grant you 1 point. And then the second option is talking about LCA optimization on embodied carbon. I would say the tougher one, and the one that actually companies do not always aspire to achieve, because it can be very complicated. When I go into the first one, you see that they're in the text, they are, I would say, different levels or shades or grades of LCA information. So when you look at the first bullet, first of all, they will say you have to use at least 20 different permanently installed products, 10 different permanently installed products from 3 different manufacturers, so you can read the text. But they grant you already a point if you actually not have an EPD, but just an LCA report. The ones that I have circulated or have in red is where we actually talk about EPDs, because the second one, product specific type through internally reviewed EPD, is not a really EPD in our understanding, because an internal review is not an external review. The wording already says it. So for us, this is a bit confusing as EPD International, but EPD World. But in essence, it's a bit of a misuse, I would say, of the word EPD, because if you would have an internally reviewed LCA result, you would have a self-declaration or a type 2 document. But anyway, I guess this has to do also that they're relating to different standards. Maybe ISO 21930 says something slightly different than 1584. But when we talk about EPDs, we talk about either an industry-wide type 3 EPD, which may include different kinds of manufacturers that join up and provide an industry sector EPD, as the word says. So it's an average. Or you have a product-specific environmental product declaration that follows ISO 425 and is product-specific, so the lowest one. And you see, I would say this is what we call the highest of quality of goods, in a sense, reporting environmental performance of your products in a credible and comparable way. The second option, and here I don't have so much to say, is really much about that you have to provide a report basically based upon LCA studies or EPDs, where you show the improvement of a product over time. So you will have to provide a separate document, an embodied carbon optimization report, or an action plan that is provided next to the LCA and EPD studies. So in essence, it's showing the performance over time in the sense of the improvements of a product that you're using in your LEED scheme project. The EC regulatory framework is another example now for legal compliance that I brought with me for you. And maybe here I have to quickly step back. So currently there is a voting going on. Currently means within the next coming weeks, month, on this is what I'm going to share to you. So some of this information is still a proposal, so it's not hard law. So don't make a mistake that you think this is what counts. So this is a proposal, but we foresee that it will be implemented very close to what is being proposed. But what it shows you is a framework where different, I would say, activities or different levels are nicely, I say, joining or strengthening or förstärka på svenska, the activities from, I would say, from a meta level to a more like a national level. So when we look at the eco-design for sustainable products regulation, which is, I will show you in the next slide, is the overarching framework. So the umbrella framework, in case you don't have a specific regulation in place. And I will talk about that later, but in Europe, we have the so-called construction products regulation. The word already says it, it's a regulation. And what do we mean with that here? That all 27 member states of the European Union have to adopt this one by one. So there's no room for interpretation. So they can't have their own interpretation, because then it would be a directive. And these two, so these regulations and directives on top also, of course, feed into different kinds of methodologies. So here, for example, we have the levels for sustainable assessments of buildings, which is a methodology. But again, that plays into what is also keeping your brains busy, the EU taxonomy, for example, our EPBD, so our directive for sustainable buildings, or for public procurement, the EED. And to make it even more inclusive and conclusive is that these kind of activities also directly feed into national approaches in a sense of product public procurements or environmental building assessments in a member state level. To make it a bit more concrete, what this means from what the regulator will expect in the future here in Europe. Again, we have here, you see the ESPR, so the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. And this was presented in March 2022 and the so-called EU Spring Package as part of the EU Green Deal. And in this attempt here, then also to provide the necessary rules and tools to address environmental challenges. But now when we talk about the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, so again, the ESPR, I already mentioned earlier, it is the regulatory umbrella framework, but in this case, really in case no specific legislation exists, so that you can address environmental sustainability in the EU market, in the green market. This picture also shows that there is already complementary product-specific EU regulation in place. So here on the left-hand side, you see for left-hand side, you see the CPR, so the construction products regulation. You see also a packaging directive, you see chemical legislation, and you see a battery regulation. So these precede the ESPR. At the same time, the construction products regulation as is currently, and therefore this is a proposal, is being updated, and therefore it is now up for voting with the European Commission to align more under the ESPR. And that means that the CPR also in the future will include or will comply with the framework that's provided here. So you will have to report performance information. There will be a new digital product passport that will be introduced. So this data, currently also in EPD, will be transported digitally. So there's a lot of effort going in the European Union here right now in digitizing data, for example, from PDFs, as we work with. It will also have in new requirements on labeling, public procurement, but also, for example, that the European Commission is very clear on they want to stop the destruction of unsold goods, just for example, for keeping the price up by taking out unsold parties, for example, packages. Yes, and how does that all then add up? So the digital product passport then is a tool that will contain, and I will drop it here, the declaration of performance and the declaration of conformity and other information. And in the DOP, which is a necessity for your products to be in the market for construction sectors when you fall under the CPR, because it also is linked to the Conformité Européenne, so the CE mark. And this example is really to bring in environmental information into the declaration of performance, because so far this is not existing. And what information is it then that we're looking at when the regulator is requesting from manufacturers to then report? And that's currently in the proposal. So when you know that the CPR is following the European standard EN 15804, in that standard we have, I think in total, 32 or 33 indicators, of which these 8 or 9 are core. And of these core indicator sets that you see here on the right hand, the proposition now is to make climate change effects mandatory for reporting in all member states. And then it's up to the member state, so Germany or the Netherlands or Sweden or Italy, if they would require additional indicators, that you also have to report that. But climate change effects should become mandatory. The underlying market mechanism is for manufacturers who are present with their products in multiple markets, so multiple national markets, of course. Better to report the entire data set so you're safe, so you don't have to go back in your LCA calculations when you realize, oops, now I'm missing information for the Czech, for the Belgian market, for example. The good news is that the EPD contains this information. So if you report an EPD, you already are reporting according to core indicators and potentially even more, depending on the product category and the construction, the CPR. So the PCR, the product category rules that apply for your specific product category. So CPR and PCR are something completely different. So the CPR is the construction product regulation. So that's the regulation of the rule of the regulator. And the PCR that you also will hear a lot in the EPD world is the product category rules, the cookbook for the LCA. And the good thing is, like we said, you would be currently compliant with this by providing this information. Though, and that's an important thing that is also now being discussed, there's also in parallel going on a so-called CPR acquis. So we have the current CPR that is valid and is what the rule that you have to follow. Then we have the proposal, and the regulator now said, like, okay, the proposal is a good start, but it's not good enough. So before we have the approval of the proposal, we will now not sequentially, but in parallel start already the update of what we're currently voting for. And that's the CPR key. And in the CPR key, they're now discussing how to deal with EPD information. So shall it be an EPD, or does it have to then be transferred in a DOP, or can you just link the EPD? We simply don't know yet really what the status is here. But the rumor goes that the regulator has a tendency to make the DOP a legally binding document and an EPD a non-legally binding document. But what that means in essence, in consequence, we simply don't know, because this is a CPR key, and that one will end somewhere end of this year. But what's important is that it's the same method. You're reporting exactly the same impact categories. So it's safe to say that with having an EPD, you're on the safe side. And then how then it's reported later, then it's something that remains to be seen. Another national compliance example, this is follows the methodology, so the EU levels methodology. So the one that I showed you earlier, as part of this package, the levels, the method here is something that we adopted here in the Nordics, so the Nordic countries in Europe. So that means in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and to a certain extent also Finland. But if for Sweden, I brought the example that from actually last year, January, whenever you want to put a new building in the market, it needs to have an LCA on the building level. So building level LCA, which is called a climate declaration. And the climate declaration is in essence a type 2, so a self-declared statement. And the reason there is that the regulator, so Boverket, the Ministry of Housing, understood that it's too complex for smaller SMEs to provide a lot of LCA and EPDs, which can be quite costly. So they said, okay, if you don't have specific data for your products, you can make use of generic data that are provided by the regulator. So in this case, they provided a database that contains CO2 values for 171 generic construction materials and resources. So you can make use of that, but then you have to realize that that data set is conservative value, so not the best value, a very conservative value, and the regulator has added a 25% higher than typical value. So what the regulator is doing here is they want to disincentivize you from making use of that generic data. But if you then want to switch instead to specific data, so providing your product specific information, you have to comply with EN 15.4, in essence, saying you have to provide an EPD. And this is not in the law, so you won't find that in the text, but the regulator has provided guiding materials, so supporting guiding materials, where it's specified what you then have to perform, what you have to produce in order to comply with the provision of specific data under this law. So you see, for example, in Sweden, this is already valid. In Denmark, also this year, it has also become a mandatory requirement. And in Finland, for example, they're now looking into also bringing this to market quite soon. Whereas the initiator of these activities was actually Norway. In Norway, they have this already since 2018 for public constructions. So not for all buildings, but for public construction works. Another example, closer maybe to your footsteps, so you have your door, is the so-called US Buy Clean California Act. This is also an act, so I would say a regulation, but particularly for California state. And we know that California is the 5th largest market in the world, so it has a big impact. But here the regulator is requesting EPDs for all public works projects if you have an eligible material. And the eligible materials are structural steel, hot rolled sections, etc. Structural steel, concrete, reinforcing steel, flat glass, and mineral wool board insulation. Now, what the regulator is also doing, they have set the carbon footprint. So in this one, you see that we also setting carbon footprints, some sooner or later, so a roof. But they also specify already now in this act what it means that if your product should be eligible, so in this case, hot rolled structural steel sections, it has a maximum acceptable global warming limitation of 1 million megatons. So in that sense, they have strictly said, if your product is performing worse than what we have set as a limit, you can't participate, more or less. Good news is that also the federal state has provided a funding of $250 million to establish this EPD system in the US market. EPD International is also present since quite recently ourselves in the North American market, so we know exactly what's going on. And of course, it's our task to make EPDs as globally accepted as possible, because what we do see that different regimes or different nations have different interpretations or acceptance of EPDs. So it's, as a program operator, of course, our job to align where we can with the different standards that are set out by the dictator, the legislator, who then in the end dictates. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. I apologize for that. Yes, I also talked about digitization, and I know some countries or some regions in the world are working faster and others are a little bit behind, but digitalization is very important, at least here in Europe. And we see this coming now, of course, also with the US. If this market is going to be swamped with EPDs, you have to find, I would say, efficient solutions of handling this kind of data. So what this slide is showing is on the left-hand side, the data provision. So a company X working with an LCA consultant in-house or outsourced. I would say the latter is more frequently the case. Working with some kind of a license of an LCA software program. Think about CIMA Pro, Sphera, OpenLCA, but also, for example, with tools. So here, for example, we have the concrete tool that is established in the US market, but also in Europe, that you can make use of for simplified LCA and EPD development and publication. But these tools then need to be verified by a program operator. In the middle, you see EPD International. So we have a portal where then a manufacturer manages their EPD developments. And I would say the data transfer from company or LCA consultant to our portal can be from fully manual to also fully automated. So we're working here, for example, with APIs. Once that information is here, then of course also we make sure that the information then becomes verified with a verifier of your choice. And then once the information is approved, so it's actually an EPD and it's verified data, of course we also provide an API on the other side for the data users. And the data user of an EPD typically is a regulator. It could also be design an analytics platform, which is making use of the information, for example, in building information modeling systems and other kinds of different kinds of softwares. It can also be used directly by an end user, of course, your client who's asking for that information, or other kinds of data providers who I would say are more presenting the EPD information in a context. So for example, in a material data sheet where they collect other kinds of product information and they want to link all the different specifications of that product. So the EPD, linking EPD to a safety data sheet, etc., so that you start working on a master data sheet. So that's the typical ways of using and why EPDs are needed, because this part of the spectrum are more and more asking for specific data because generic data no longer are sufficient. And to give you an example, the Norwegian state they actually rejected I would say an EPD or an EPD-like document because the information or the data that were in that document were 3 years old. And in the LCA world, that's an acceptable number, but for the regulator, obviously, it didn't suffice. He said, no, information too old, you have to provide more update data, specific data on your products, otherwise you're not part of a tender. So yes, this is definitely where we're moving. And I think that's it from my side. And now I'm curious if there's questions. And if I missed something.
If you missed something, then we missed a lot. Sebastiaan, thank you so much. We do have questions already in the chat. They are actually in English. And if Sophie Ellebrock doesn't feel okay to say it herself, so I will read it to you. She's asking whether, she said, I wonder if by having the product data so exposed, in brackets, a company doesn't lose competitiveness. Can you share your perception on that? This potential exposure?
Yeah, I can comment maybe on one end, and I'm also inviting Philippe, of course, also to comment or compliment. But in essence, I would say an EPD doesn't contain, I would say, business sensitive information. The EPD is a public document where we try to refrain from making information public, like recipes or supply data that you don't want to have on the street. This information is contained in the so-called LCA report, so the LCA background report. And this LCA background report is only shared in that sense between the manufacturer and the verifier. So even we as EPD International, we don't see that document. We only can ask it for upon request if there's a question about an EPD from a peer or a client. They say like, hey, how are the calculations? But it's up to the manufacturer then to share or not. So it's not a mandatory requirement to share the LCA background report. In that sense, I think it's that's the statement that I have. So exposed, no. I think yes, in that sense, but then yes, because as a company, of course, you're letting your pants down because you're showing the performance and how we call it, you're showing the good, the bad, and the evil. And an EPD is a declaration. An EPD is not an eco-label. So we, as EPD International, don't tell the data user if your product is bad or good. But the data, of course, then is used, as we saw already, in benchmarking exercises. So, of course, you will have a comparison between peers and products. But that's the, I would say, also the essence of an EPD, and EPD is providing transparency. So EPD International is not selling green products. We're selling transparency to the market.
Great, thank you. Sophie, feel free to ask another question if this wasn't answered properly. Now, Carla Klein also has 2 questions, but I believe they were asked in the middle of your explanation, so it may be out of context now, but I will read them to you. In this case, we need to publish and pay for CPR to meet the regulation and EPD to meet certification. And then the next question from Carla is both labels CPR and EPD must be published on EnvironDeck platform, for instance.
Yeah, it's a good question, but there's maybe also something here to straighten out. So no misconception or confusion. The CPR currently is a rule that exists, so it's part of the CE mark. So, but it doesn't contain environmental information. So if you have a product in the European Union that is CE marked, you already have to have a declaration of performance. But a declaration of performance goes via a notified body. And currently in the European Union, we don't have notified bodies for carbon disclosure or for environmental disclosure in that sense. That's what the European Commission is now currently discussing in the CPR key, how that then in the future may or should look like. So yes, you will have a DOP, but that's not with the EPD International. To comply with the CPR, which is a compliance document. And so it's not the same, you know, but once the CPR comes into place, and you have, and I want to make the statement clear, the CPR is only valid for the European Union, right? It's European Union, a document that was provided for the European Union. So we have a lot of clients who are working on a global market. So if you want to be in the US market, then you will have the DOP has no value. So the EPD has a value, or in Brazil, the EPD has a value because maybe the Brazilian regulator accepts an EPD as a legally binding document. But that it remains to be seen. But currently, the CPR, so the CPR doesn't contain environmental information, and the EPD does. I hope I was clear, but otherwise I can try to rephrase it again.
Okay. Let's wait for Carla's reaction, whether she is okay with the answers. Then I have one from Carlos Conde. He's from ArcelorMittal here in Brazil, and he is asking whether the Buy Clean California Act is already ongoing or established, or is it being revised?
It's both. It's there, and it has been revised, and we will see many more revisions because it's I would say a fairly incomplete act. And the regulator also understood, we had a first good shot from the hips, but now we have to refine it. So yes and yes. And what I can also say, it's not only in California, other federal states have also implemented it, adopted it. And now with this $250 million, of course, the attempt is, of course, to bring this up to the federal level so that the whole of the US and that ultimately will have to have some kind of a Clean Buy Act in place. But currently, it's state by state that are adopting this kind of requirement.
Great. So we have from Camila also a question. Maybe Felipe can add to Sebastian's answer here. Is there a perspective for regulation in this sense here in Brazil?
We have a lot of discussions about this, about regulation, and there is some meetings to, I think it's a federal instance about sustainable, compras sustentáveis, eu esqueci o nome em inglês agora, desculpa.
Purchasing or procurement?
Yeah.
I think it's procurement.
Ana, para que eu tô respondendo em inglês, né? Well, Portuguese is better, right? Sorry, Sebastian, I will answer in Portuguese, right? Okay. Então, existe algumas discussões.
I'm your guest, Felipe, so please take it in your own language.
Oh, no problem. Thanks. Então, existe sempre algumas discussões, tem algumas reuniões sobre compras sustentáveis, existem alguns critérios que o governo ele tenta colocar, mas normalmente para eles mesmos, né, que eu conheço, assim, né, uma regulamentação pensando no governo, para o próprio governo sobre compras sustentáveis, por exemplo. Agora, uma legislação, alguma coisa assim, do Brasil, eu não tenho conhecimento. Bom, como temos várias pessoas dessa área aqui, e acontece isso muito rápido, às vezes em várias coisas em paralelo, se alguém souber, pode compartilhar conosco.
Eu acho que no contexto da nova lei de licitações, que foi
Sim,
publicada em 1º de abril de 2021, né, haverá esforços de capacitação, mas também de como tornar tudo mais comparável. Eu acredito que haverá um resgate daquelas fichas. Chegaram a ser feitas algumas fichas para alguns produtos, para facilitar, né, o agente comprador a compreender as opções, as alternativas que estavam participando de alguma licitação, por exemplo.
sim, verdade. Fábio.
Can I go back to the questions now? Okay. But I do have questions for you too, Felipe, so stay tuned. Isabel Schultz is asking, what are the main difficulties in Brazil in the agricultural market to have EPD? That's a tough one, Isabel.
Well, bom, na verdade, eu acho que a parte agrícola, ela é muito forte, a parte de estudos em ACV. Até a própria Rede aqui tem muitas discussões nessa parte, tem inventários, tem o próprio programa RenovaBio. Então, assim, eu acho que a questão de maturidade desse processo é bem evoluído. A questão, eu acho que existe... A construção civil, ela tem uma alavancagem, né? Como o próprio Sebastiaan mostrou, existem certificações como certificação Aqua, HQE no Brasil, LEED, e outros lugares como o BREEAM, que alavancam, né, esse processo na construção civil. Então, na verdade, ele lê que tem um requisito, ele vai ganhar ponto, então ele vai e você estimula o mercado. A questão agrícola, a gente tem... eu acho que tem que ter uma percepção de ganho, talvez para exportadores ou coisas assim. Mas como o próprio Sebastião ele comentou, eu acho que a questão de alimentos, eu acho que estilo de vida sustentável, até ele citou, né, comida vegana, né? O estilo de vida sustentável são pessoas que já têm um perfil de procurar e saber mais informações sobre o próprio produto, né? Quando você compra, às vezes, um leite de, sei lá, castanha, uma coisa assim, normalmente ele já tem selo, ele já fala um pouquinho sobre isso, tal. Então, eu acho que é uma questão de tempo para se ter EPDs para esses produtos, especialmente os que você tem esse viés assim de estilo de vida sustentável. Acho que seriam os primeiros onde que... Porque quando o cliente pede, é mais ou menos isso, por isso que a construção civil aumentou, né? Quando o cliente pede, a gente se movimenta mais rápido, normalmente é assim, né? Então, o cliente final fala, mas eu queria comprar um produto vegano que tem impacto ambiental baixo. Pronto, aí a indústria se movimenta. Na construção civil, como é B2B, né, a construtora ela fala assim, eu quero que os produtos tenham EPD porque eu estou fazendo certificação Aqua, LEED. Aí vai lá e o mercado se movimenta com uma velocidade maior. Eu acho que é questão só de velocidade, na minha opinião.
Eu estava comentando aqui no chat em resposta à pergunta da Isabel, que ano passado a gente conheceu algumas EPDs de alimentos, né? No caso, o pessoal da Alegra Foods e também
Por exemplo,
rotulagem tipo 1 para os cafés especiais,
sim.
né? Que a Juliana conectou a gente com a pessoa que veio palestrar. Então, se alguém tiver interesse em aplicações de EPDs ou de rotulagem em alimentos, a gente compartilha, a gente gravou aquela reunião, como todas, aliás, e também temos as apresentações.
O pessoal da Alegra apresentou ano passado, né? Alegra Foods, as EPDs, né? São 6 EPDs,
agosto,
isso.
acho.
E tem bacon brasileiro com EPD, tem salame. É muito bom, dá para comer e ver o impacto ambiental e a informação nutricional do produto.
E talvez, Felipe, comentar também que na capacitação, que é direito aí, contrapartida para quem é associado da rede, mas também dá para fazer sem ser associado, A gente explora tanto cases de construção, como a gente também tem a possibilidade de fazer customizado para falar do agro ou de alimentos, no caso.
Uhum. Exatamente. A gente monta o estudo de caso conforme a turma, assim, o perfil da turma. Isso é bem legal, na verdade, para se discutir, né?
Legal. Estou vendo aqui uma pergunta do Felipe e da Suzano. So I will switch back to English, Sebastian. How do you see the maturity to understand other LCA impact categories aside from carbon footprint?
Is it specific for, I saw this was specific for the Brazilian market, or is this in general?
I believe it's in general, and maybe then Felipe can do the regionalization of the answer.
I would say complex, but because I mean, I would say the regulator and and also the private sector understands now fairly what CO2 is. We no longer see CO2 as purely evil or something that is just there. We have some kind of a feeling. But if I talk about SOx or NOx, they say, "Hä, va? Vad pratar du om?" So that's basically algebra or something like that. At the same time, it's a very important. I always try to phrase this as it's a mosaic. So sustainability is not only carbon, and especially when you talk about the agriculture sector, CO2 is by far not the most important emitter or impact that you're working with, because you're thinking about acidification and eutrophication, for example. But the regulator currently tries to regulate CO2, and I think that was this decision that we made. But we do see also that different kinds of regulations are now coming more and more into whole life LCA, including carbon, but also additional indicators, because they have understood that it's just one piece of the big picture of the big puzzle. But Frank honestly said, so when we look about EU taxonomy, when we look about the carbon adjustment mechanism that the European Commission is discussing, yes, it's focusing very much on carbon. And another reason is there also that to provide LCA depends on where you are in the world. The background data, the LCA background data, are simply not existing. So there's a generic data set for Europe or for global, but there may be not an LCA database to do proper acidification calculations for LCA data for Brazil or for Asia. We know that these data are being developed also with a lot of activities going on, but they're simply not existing yet in many areas. So you could argue that currently carbon is the most accurate in the sense of data availability, depending on the region where you are. I think for Europe, we have a fairly good overview, very good data source that we can fall back on, but not for all parts of the world. So, but by having said that, the EPD is following, I would say, also methods where we do feel safe enough that this is a robust method. But also the European Commission is now having indicators in there like ecotoxicity, biodiversity indicators, where we know that the method is not very robust, and therefore, but the European Commission, of course, wants to have a complete picture, an as complete picture as possible. But as a manufacturer, as a data user, we know that that information actually transfers very limited knowledge or information because it just simply doesn't make sense. You don't know what to do with it. I agree. But the core data set that you see is something that we work with. But of course, the mostly requested information is carbon, so the GWP. Yes, I see the...
Você quer complementar com alguma coisa?
Yeah, forest-based products.
Okay.
Sorry, that was the last question. So about maturity, yes, construction sector by far is the most mature. Having said that, forestry, of course, here in the Nordics is also very strong. They have been doing different pilots with the EU Commission, but it's not as commonly used, and maybe also because of, I would say, the setup, because forestry typically has larger companies, so not so many, whereas the construction market has lots of very small SMEs, M&Es. working in a very national market, and maybe forestry in the Nordics at least is broader than that. So I think also in a number of EPDs, I think it also has to do something how the industry itself looks like as well. My wife is working for Stora Enso, and I know that they have a forestry management company, one of the largest landowners from the Nordics. And they also have lots of EPDs for their wood-based products, but then indeed, again, for the construction sector. So wood finding a place in the sector. But yes, but we see when we talk about Asia, that Asia is waking up, and they're waiting for our PCR for electronics and handheld devices, because Samsung and all the big ones also, of course, want to report carbon and LCA results of their products in a credible way, and then particularly for export reasons to Europe.
Ok, great, thank you. Tem uma pergunta aqui da Ana Murad. Eu acho que, Felipe, é a tua última a atualização que você fez para a gente ano passado, né? Talvez você não tenha uma estatística mais recente ainda, mas qual que é a proporção de EPDs no mundo para os alimentícios em relação aos demais tipos de produtos, né? E quais os principais mercados para tenham EPD? Eu acho que você mostrou para a gente que construção tem uma tradição maior, né?
Construção é a maior, acho que já tem uma outra pergunta. But Sebastiaan, can you help us here? What is the proportion of EPDs for food products comparing to other types? I think it's the second one. The first one, it's construction products, and the second, it's the food and beverage, right?
I can. So yeah. I just I thought I interpreted the question correctly. So 2 weeks ago we had a release of Jane Anderson's stats, and there actually she is one of the persons from the UK who is doing stats on EPDs, and she released 2 weeks ago that there are currently 130,000 construction product EPDs available globally. So 130,000 for the construction sector. And I would say that's also the large bulk. So then we have indeed food, and I can quickly check in our system. I have to call the Power BI. Give me one minute. But I think it's the second, but I would say if I would apply, so I would say 80%, 90% of all EPDs comes from construction, and the remaining 10 is then shared with other industries. Also, the reason is that we are one of the very few program operators who is providing PCRs for non-construction materials. And when I then, I'm quickly gonna check if I can see it, if I give you a more accurate number, but it's in the slide. That cannot have changed. Support. So, sorry, this is. I'm just trying to give you a quick numbers.
No,
don't worry. Here in Brazil. Sorry.
No. Just to let Sebastiaan look for the data, and meanwhile, maybe Felipe can answer the question posed here by Daniela in the chat.
Oh, Daniela.
Poderiam comentar sobre EPD no setor de energia, equipamentos como painéis solares, aerogeradores.
Tá. Só um detalhe sobre no Brasil, alimentos, né, dá cerca de 15%, o resto é construção civil, mais ou menos. A gente tem umas 40 EPDs e aí 6 são de alimentos, mais ou menos, né? Existem alguns editais que falam sobre a questão de energia, alguns produtos específicos, por exemplo, eu sei, alguns editais que a própria Enel coloca, e a Enel se aplica no Brasil também, né? Então, é italiana, mas os editais dela acho que sai como padrão em compra de equipamentos, essa parte nesse setor elétrico. Então, assim, até esqueci, né? Me perguntaram sobre regulamentação e exigências. Não é uma exigência governamental, mas esse é um bom exemplo de uma empresa multinacional que, quando vai comprar um produto, um serviço, ele já coloca no edital e aí, às vezes, a sede de outro país, tipo o Brasil, fala assim: ah, mas aqui tem que pedir? Tem que pedir também. Então, eu acho que essa tendência, não só governamental, mas de empresas, especialmente as multinacionais, tem um padrão, por exemplo, na Europa, e ele estabelece esse padrão para o mundo inteiro. Então, aí os fornecedores talvez tenham que se virar, né? Num primeiro momento. Mas é a maturidade do mercado, né? Ok. Ok, Sebastian.
Yeah, so I'm sharing a slide which is not the latest information, but I think it gives a good feeling of where the EPDs are. So construction sector, by far the largest. Then second biggest indeed is food and beverages. Then we have textiles and footwear and apparel. So apparel is specifically here also, I would say, blue collar, so functional wear. So not fashion industry, but more functional wear. Furniture, paper products, metals and minerals, so base products, chemicals, and then also other categories. But you can see construction products, food and beverage and textiles are the ones that are picking up. And also when I visited last year Argentina, we had all discussions with the meat producers and with the polo, so what is it, the chicken producers, industry associations also actively supporting EPDs. So we can see an uptake of EPDs in those food categories, where we know that, for example, here in the Nordics, the salmon industry is very interested also to share the information. So it depends a bit on the categories from different countries, but I would say food is the next one that will come quite quickly, because they also have this need to share transparently the performances of their products.
Perfect. And we have already. Can you also share this one specific slide with us afterwards?
Yes, I would have. I will look into updating them, because this is a bit an outdated one, but I just wanted to give you a bit of the feeling. So
yes, perfect. Very visual. And Camila is asking me to address again the capacity building I mentioned earlier. Camila, aqui é a nossa, e os demais, né? Aqui é a nossa trilha de aprendizado, o nome até foi dado aqui pelo próprio Felipe na época. Então, a gente compartilha todo esse conhecimento que a rede tem em diferentes módulos e também diferentes complexidades, né? Então, o primeiro talvez seja o mais de iniciação, digamos assim, de como é que a gente muda a chave na cabeça, né? De começar a pensar mais ciclo de vida até nas nossas interações diárias aí como cidadãos, mas também na empresa. E o de rotulagem ambiental, que a gente mencionou aqui algumas vezes, né? O Felipe, no passado, a gente fez várias turmas explorando cases de construção, mas em razão dessas novas EPDs surgindo, ou casos de rotulagem surgindo em aplicações em alimentos, a gente também customiza dependendo da composição da turma. Então, quem tiver interesse, fale depois com a gente, que a gente vai explorar qual desses módulos aqui faz mais sentido para a realidade de vocês. Deu 10 horas, eu também quero agradecer novamente a participação de todos. A gente ficou muito feliz aqui no Paralelo com uma participação tão grande. Como a gente disse, foi uma reunião aberta justamente para ouvir de vocês, se não agora, mas depois entrem em contato para a gente, como é que a gente pode incluir desafios de vocês no escopo desse GT ou de outro. Agora, em março, a gente tradicionalmente é o nosso mês de planejamento de atividades. A gente também tem a Assembleia Geral Ordinária no final do mês, por sermos uma associação. Então, se a gente puder incluir alguma coisa que é extremamente estratégica para vocês, por favor, entrem em contato. E aí a Liliane, a Juliana, o Felipe aqui, a gente vai considerar isso nas ações. Sebastiaan, again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your time with us. I would say that you have to be our strategic partner from now on, but let's discuss this afterwards. Felipe, thank you so much also for doing here, for bridging our contacts. Well, I'll stop talking.
thank you all. Thank you, Sebastian. It's an excellent presentation for us. I believe that the all peoples liked a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Felipe.
Thanks, Sebastian.
It was a pleasure being with you, and the line is open. So if you have questions, either directly to Felipe in Portuguese, and if you want to talk English,
or Swedish, right?
Or Swedish, or Dutch, or German. It's up to you. So, vi hörs, vi ses, auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen. See you.
Ciao.
Ciao. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you so much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.